From one foul setting the tone for a bitter feud between Larry Bird and Bill Laimbeer, to the fact that there's an entire game just to show what the NBA thought of the Pistons player, it looks like the Celtics legend still holds a lot of resentment towards the Detroit Pistons middleman. All this because of one bad foul? Seems like it. You see, when you walk on the court, you assume the risk that you might get hurt. Now, while the NBA has been fiercely protective of its players and have issued some pretty strict repercussions over the years, players know that there's no such thing as a career without at least one foul. Larry Bird has had his fair share of fouls, injuries, and then some, like how he got into a pretty heated confrontation with Julius Erving once, and earlier on, threw a punch at Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But the Celtics legend was known to keep his rivalry strictly on the court. Besides these two incidents, Bird's record was spotless. He'd engage in trash talk, sure, but he'd never get into a physical altercation with other players. His spotless record earned its only blemish back in 1988 when he got into a pretty heated altercation with the Pistons' Bill Laimbeer. Now, what had happened was that Bird was going up for a shot. Dennis Rodman was at his heels, and Laimbeer was looking for a way to help his teammate out. What did he do? He yanked Bird down to the ground. Bird was angry, and understandably so. The two hadn't even gotten up when they started throwing punches at each other. Some of their more cool-headed teammates stepped in to keep their fight from escalating. I mean, it was a pretty monumental game, and tensions between the Celtics and the Pistons were already sky high. Everyone was scared the fans would take inspiration from their on-court bout and start throwing punches at each other in the stands. Wait, keep that in mind. I'll get to that later on in the video. Okay, so back to Bird and Laimbeer. When their teammates separated them, Bird could be seen mean mugging Laimbeer, the Pistons center. On the other hand, he just shrugged it off like it was no big deal, which angered Bird a whole lot more. I mean, Bill was aggressive. The fall could have injured Bird, who was already playing on an injured back. And it looked like Bill didn't even care. He wanted to hurt Bird. So what did the guy who'd only ever shown excellent sportsmanship up until that match do? He hit Laimbeer on the shoulder with the ball. Bird was fouled immediately for throwing the ball and hitting Laimbeer on purpose. He was ejected as the Pistons fans started chanting all kinds of obscenities at the guy. Laimbeer, again, just looked amused. Their 1988 matchup was the third game between the two rivaling sides in the Eastern Conference. The Celtics had been leading the games 2-0, but the Pistons won round 3. At the end of the game, the Celtics walked off the court without shaking their opponent's hands. Not a good look for good guy Larry and his side, right? Well, years later, a former member of the Celtics coaching team told fans that the team didn't walk off because they were sour that they'd lost, sure. Yeah, okay, or that Larry was mad at Bill and instructed his side to walk off without acknowledging them. Again, yeah, sure. But that they'd actually walked off because of a security threat and the coaching staff wanted to keep things tame before this turned into an incident of malice at the Silverdome. Look, I'm just here to tell you what both sides of the story are. Pistons legend Isaiah Thomas, he still thinks it was because of what happened between Bird and Laimbeer that night, while Celtics fans say that couldn't be the case, and that Bird wouldn't give Laimbeer the time of day. Are you sure about that? Because it looks like Bird's still not over what happened in 1988. At the post-match conference, Laimbeer told the press that he hadn't yanked Bird on purpose. He said that he saw Bird attempting to shoot, Rodman attempting to undercut him, and just used Bird to break his fall. The Celtics forward rolled his eyes at the statement. He said that if that was true, then he didn't hit Laimbeer on purpose either, and that he was actually throwing the ball at the referee. Anyway, the Pistons ended up being the more dominant team for the remainder of the season. In fact, they even went on to win the Eastern Conference Championship 2 years running. The Celtics had a long way to go, and it didn't help that Bird's back pain was nagging him more and more with every game. But still, that should have been the end of their feud, right? I mean, it was one foul after all, and Bird got his revenge later on, right? Then why is he so pressed about it to this day? Well, according to the hick from French Lick, Laimbeer wanted to maim him. Yep, that's a pretty strong allegation, but that's just how Bird sees it. To be fair, Laimbeer was known for being a dirty player. In fact, if you weren't a Pistons fan, you'd probably hate him just as much as anyone else did. Bird told Ben Simmons in 2013 after the incident that he still hated Laimbeer. He talked about the 1988 foul and said that it wasn't like he hadn't been yanked before, but Bill wanted to make sure he'd never stand up again. Yikes. Anyway, besides this one incident, Bird had a good reputation among players. For instance, Johnson was one of his closest friends off the court. In fact, Bird was one of the very first people to know about Johnson's HIV diagnosis that forced Magic into early retirement. Oh, speaking of retirement, the game's fans were broken when Larry Bird announced that he'd be retiring after only 45 games. Why? His bad back had caught up to him, and he couldn't do the game he loved justice anymore. Everyone, even Pistons fans, was upset over the news. But one Pistons player spared no opportunity to poke fun at Bird. Take a guess, yup, it was Bill Laimbeer. So Laimbeer told reporters that he didn't want to go down like Larry Bird did, which, I mean, if you ask me, it was pretty weird considering how Bird scored 20 points per game on average. That too, with a bad back, and all Laimbeer was ever known for was being a villain in the NBA. Larry Bird ended up getting the last word though. Bill's comments about one of the NBA's finest won him no favors. But Bird wasn't one to let it get to his head. During Larry Bird night, he told reporters who asked him if he wished Bill would have been there that night, that if he'd come, he'd be standing in the rafters with his jersey on. Oh, and here's another interesting tidbit for you guys. So remember how Laimbeer said he'd do anything to not retire like Larry did? Yeah, well, he held up to his bargain and actually retired under seriously controversial circumstances. Apparently, during the 1993-94 season, Bill got into a heated altercation with Thomas. That ended up with the Pistons' favorite in the hospital room, with a broken hand. And yeah, in case you were wondering, the Pistons' favorite I'm talking about here is Thomas, not Bill. Laimbeer was apparently so heartbroken by it all, the fact that he'd hurt his teammate, and the fact that Pistons fans would have his head when they found out that he decided to retire earlier than expected after the 1993-94 season. So now Larry has a leg up in their ongoing feud. And since the two players retired ages ago, surely the fight's over now, right? Think again, because Bill continues to take shots at Bird every chance he gets. You'd think the two would stop it already, but no, this guy's constantly trying to bring Bird down every chance he gets. When 10-17, the fans. Bill Kravitz asked him about his comments on the Indiana Pacers' lack of postseason success, knowing full well that this would lead to another Bill versus Bird controversy headline. Since Bird was the executive for the Pacers at the time, Bill responded like everyone expected him to. He said that had he been in Bird's place, he'd just quit. Ouch. So, even as a man who's since retired, Bill Laimbeer continues to be one of the most controversial players the NBA's ever seen, which is why it comes as no surprise that Bird still hates him. I mean, to be fair, did anyone really like Laimbeer? Pistons fans did, sure, up until he maimed Thomas. But even before that, Laimbeer had a reputation for being the league bad boy. So much so, actually, that Super Nintendo Entertainment System released a game to commemorate his persona. It's called Bill Laimbeer's Combat Basketball. The game's set in 2031, when Laimbeer's the NBA commissioner and he's fired all the referees. Which means no rules, everything and anything goes, even using firearms on court. So yeah, Laimbeer's never really had the best reputation, and the fact that good guy Larry didn't like him proves it. So from the game that shows how much people hated Bill Laimbeer to the foul that kicked off a feud that'll last to this day, this was everything on the Bird versus Laimbeer feud.